to the seminar, What Does Mediation Do? It's the first meeting in the cycle, which is called Time for Cultural Mediation. And I'm happy to introduce our guest, but before that, a little bit on the framework and context of the whole session cycle. Not all of you might have been present on the first introductory meeting. That's why I will give a short summary on what this all is about. So the stimulus for this cycle of seminars was the translation of the book Time for Cultural Mediation, which was originally published in Switzerland. And although the full version will be published in Russian only early next year, we would like to start discussing the main subjects and issues within this area already now. And by we, I mean the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art and the Ural Industrial Biennial of Contemporary Art. Marina Romanova and Darya Belikova, who are here with us. Hello, Marina. Hello, Darya. Hi, all. Thank you for the introduction. And of course, next to these two institutions, we have Alina Belishkina, who was just speaking, a curator, a teacher, an educator, who became this mediator, this third counterpart to our two institutions. And she is also the editor of the Russian translation of the book on mediation. Thank you. A couple more subjects to touch here. We did away with the word cultural, the phrase cultural mediation, for the title of our meeting. The book is called Time for Cultural Mediation, but we're not using it explicitly in order to concentrate on art and on mediation that takes place in exhibition spaces or museums and galleries. This is the most general framework for our meetings that I would like to highlight. And today we will be taking our first dive into how mediation works and what does mediation do, actually. And this title refers to a chapter in this book, and we shared fragments from it with you all beforehand, so that we're all on the same page. Our goal today is not to take a deep dive into the text of the chapter. Rather, we would like to use the starting point, use Carmen's text as a starting point, and to consider this issue from the perspective of our local specific practices, ways of thinking, and ways of understanding what mediation is and what it does, and its function in an institution, and what it does with an institution and with us. I'd like to remind those who were on the first meeting that Carmen highlighted the issue of translation. The German word Vermittlung became mediation in English, which lost all its paradoxicality, the right for error, misunderstanding, or even possible conflicts. I think that this linguistic choice is in part the reason for our own frustrations and misunderstandings. What do we mean by mediation? And recently we have been using it more and more often. Is mediation an educational practice? What is its goal? What is its function within the institution where it takes place? Does it go outside the limits of institutionalized spaces? Does it transform both the institution and its wider context? All of these questions and many other questions will be touched today with Bernadett Settele and Darya Chernikova. I'm happy to greet them here and introduce them. Bernadett is an art mediator, researcher, and professor in the Zurich Art Institute. And besides working on large international projects, for example, the 5th Berlin Biennial or Documenta 13, Bernadett has taken part in a long research initiative, Kunstvermittlung as Transformation, which was culminated in a publication last year, as far as I remember. And Bernadette's colleague today, her co-speaker, is Darya Bocharnikova. She is an architecture historian, a teacher, curator, and an institutional development counselor for the Bazaar Fine Arts Center. She was the author of the concept of the Second Equatorial School in Moscow, which was working from the precept of critical care and theory of care, which also sounds as a kind of a paradox. And that's why radical mediation or critical care might be an interesting way of discussing this due to the way these terms are constructed. So our agenda today will have a presentation by Bernadett, then a presentation by Darya, and then possible questions, reactions, and discussions between them too, and myself as a moderator with questions both from myself and from you, dear participants. Questions from you will be welcome at the very final part of our meeting. You can use the chat to ask your question in writing, or in the final part of the meeting, you may be able to ask the question with your voice directly. Use the raise hand button to ask this question. It is located in the reactions submenu.
The stage is yours, Bernadett.
Now the floor is yours, Bernadett. Over to you.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be able to speak to you, and I'm glad that so many people and listeners are here. I've been bringing you two excerpts out of writings or out of discussions and conversation I've been having. The first excerpt is out of the publication book, Art, Mediation in Transformation, namely. And the second excerpt is from an interview that was by Alena Nawrotsky, made in Zurich, but we did it virtually. It was Art Education, the title of the article was Art Education in Contemporary Art Museums. And let me just share my slide to all of you. So I hope this is fine and you can see it clearly. Like commenting, my input will be short, and I'm very happy to hear the questions and to see what everybody can contribute. I may add some comments later, but the initial thing is short. So funnily, as an introduction, this title, What Does Art Mediation Do?, is like the mirror of the title of a lecture, a performance I had about a year ago. I'll just show you. There was the initial flyer where we had another project, What Can Art Do? And this was about politically engaged art and the things it can do. So what you're seeing here is the invitation flyer, and I'll go back from that anyway, but so that's my title, What Does Art Mediation Do? And that's the idea of moving whatever in the middle. And what I can tell you, what I'm bringing is first, I talk about the standpoint or a stance towards the institution, towards changing an institution, that institution we work in and that we are working on. So it's twofold what we have. And secondly, I may add some thoughts on working towards transformative art education that concern a bit more of how to work with the public, of how to work with others. Yeah, for me it's a bit like a time travel. The excerpt out of working in and on institutions has been written by a team, by the Art Mediation and Transformation team, or by part of it. And contributors were Susanne Kudorfer, Nora Landkammer, Mikro Seyon, and myself. So I'm starting. The professional field of art mediation has experienced in recent years a boom, and the discussion about art mediation still has to deal with three conditions, I think. Firstly, the boom itself is based on something that I would call we pass on symbolic capital of art and of education. And sometimes we tend to forget that it's necessary to question the foundations of this symbolic capital as well. Secondly, mediation or art mediation often remains a service compared to exhibition making, curating. It's like we are the ones who introduce an exhibition, who explain it, who work on an exhibition and with the public after the exhibition is already set up. And we don't, not everybody, not every mediator is able to decide about the exhibition or about the programs around it. And thirdly, that art mediation is nevertheless often allowed in a way to serve as a social legitimization of institutions. So in order to prove the so-called opening of the institution, some institutions have an art mediation that is transformative, or that is critical, or that is radical, or that utters funny things or utters funny events. So this third point still is a point of symbolic capital. In our highbrow art field, possibly being transformative means something good. To a certain point, I may add. In the field of reflecting on art education, the practitioners have written a number of texts that speak of these preconditions, about institutions and their activities. But I would say the art educator still sits between two stools and has to handle different claims. Research, as in the project Art Education and Transformation, that was finished in 2012, is one way for art educators or art mediators to reflect on content and methods. So, but as I said, in the highbrow art field, it's potentially also dangerous to question our own practice, as we are only mediators. And this is also reflected, I would say, in Time for Mediation, the publication. And this is due to, it's being linked to power and knowledge in institutions. So those who question themselves are shown to be precarious, or show themselves to be precarious. So when we are working on institutions and we try to change an institution, we go a step further. But I would say I try to transform my own practice and the institution as well. But I think we need to have both claims in a way. And working in art institutions also means taking a responsibility of working on institutions, of transforming them for me. So the attitude or the standpoint towards the institution is linked to conditions. And I will speak shortly about some conditions favoring transformation or development through art education. And we found out about in this project, in this research and a development project in Switzerland. Let me see. Internal mediation is important. So if we do project work, we need a collaboration of equally involved people from different fields, like communication, art mediation, exhibition services, the guards, the curatorial office, etc. And we need to invent forms and forums to exchange about mediation within an institution. So in several projects that I have seen, mediators described a contrast between a great openness to innovation at the management level and barriers in concrete implementation. If other important institutional actors, then the management level, are not sufficiently involved, there is a danger that established communication structures and processes will stand in the way of the project or of the transformation, that is. So implementing new formats or approaches or having new questions will be stopped because of concrete problems. And we see the danger, or I see the danger, that the institution may remain untouched beyond this. The findings I talk about refer to transformation based on the model project and Kunstvermittlung, or art mediation and transformation. But I would say that we can relate it to other fields or situations as well, possibly. But let's discuss this, please. Then we found a second thing, that creating openness for processes or for transformation that are not defined by a predictable product can be difficult. So process of exhibition making are different than process of in pedagogical or in art mediation sense. The particularly concerned moments, this particularly concerns moments when it's about the visibility of art mediation, or when it's about making the results of art mediation projects accessible to further visitors, to others. Or every time when mediation is made visible, it becomes part of the curatorially and scenographically determined space. It becomes something else. And this entails, in a way, the danger of an over aestheticization of mediation, the danger of making it an exhibition, the danger of making it beautiful, and the danger of making it something else. So that's also a transformation, of course, but I'm not sure if it's a good transformation. Yeah, a third point we had was it's necessary to do a sensitive handling of existing practices. If not everybody's involved in the transformation, it must be a slow transformation of practices and of self-understandings in the team. And that's crucial for me, because transformation in our own practice needs to build on existing mediation practice. Especially a relatively outsider position. For example, if I come in as a new staff member or employed on a project basis, I can make it possible to deal with self-evidences in an unbiased way. But there are difficulties involving the other mediators in a common work of definition. Art mediation as transformation must involve the existing mediation team, and then it's possibly a slow transformation based also on human relations, as not public relations, funny, on human relations, like on getting to know each other really and being willing to cooperate and to work together, being willing to fight, maybe, and to struggle together, not against each other. So, and I see only then the transformation of mediation itself is possible, and then only then art mediation can be conceived as transformation of the institution, because only then it can be long-lasting, or it can live. So that was the first point. I just add a little bit more on working towards a transformative art education. So I talked about travel in time. Now this is 2017. We're 5 years further, almost there in a way. I learned at the point of artistic or critical art education. Like artistic art education or critical art education is often not to fulfill expectations. But we should distinguish between two different spheres of activity, I think. First, working with art and persons or third parties who may not be amateurs. And what I can do is I work on contextual dispositions and parameters. So maybe change the beliefs of a field or of an institution. And in both fields, I think a transformation is possible. But let's distinguish working on art with others from working on its institutions, as my colleagues and I did in the book Art Mediation and Transformation 5 years ago, like now 10 years ago almost. In my practice and research, I found that art education involves many different types of knowledge. We have activist approaches. We can use didactic methods. We need to draw on theories of education. We may use tactics for enabling participation, openness. We may use even authenticity and irony. Educational practice is full of nuances. It can open up fields of discussion and challenge systems, and it can also entail constructive approaches. And it can, of course, provocate or disappoint. So I would say even provocation and disappointment can be strategies or can be practices of art mediation if it's meant to be radical, critical, artistic. So I think when we conceptualize the art education program for biennial, for example, there are many things you can learn from, including art, institutional critique, sociology of organizations, group dynamics. And you can arrange these topics around political questions and principles. And then you do art education that is itself performative in order to transform, in order to transform contextual context or parameters in a way, maybe discourses and truly practices. And then there was the second excerpt I'm citing out of was an interview, I need to say. And Elena Nawrotsky then asked a question. So I'm telling you what her question was. She was stating that experimental art education challenges the public. She said it would take away the consumer mindset and the passive immersion, and maybe produce involvement and participation. And that would mean that instead of going on a guided tour through the museum space, she said, and have the artworks explained by experts, visitors think, join in, and decide for themselves. And then she asked, but is this what we want? What does a mature visitor need in order to be mature? And there, I may add just some thoughts on visitors or on participating, because I think it's crucial, and maybe for me it's a crucial point, who participates in what way. So what art mediation can do depends a lot on how it conceives the public, how it conceives the others in a way, how it conceives the people with whom it works with. So I'm sorry, but I have to read it. I'm just reading you my answer towards Elena at that point. And I was answering, a truly shared or collective enterprise for me entails the possibility for everybody of becoming active. Active not in a sense of doing something or of being allowed to do something, not just being an essential part of the undertaking. For me, the possibility of being active is being responsible for the action, taking on a part of the liability, and perhaps doing some of the planning as well. And this, it requires a major shift from attendance to participation. Merely attending an event means using it in a predetermined way. Participating means that there is also an opportunity to change the institution or situation, and of gaining some kind of agency. So when we allow attendees to participate in this way, it means giving them a role in determining structures, aims, and methods. Ultimately, that means being involved in deciding what happens, and it includes a different form of preparation for me and the different situations. A participatory public is involved long before they enter the museum space. So the false opposition between guidance and involvement falls apart as well. So with regard to the work we do with art, that I see as a collective and verbal or discursive work also, the type of discussion that I can have will change or will vary, as does the level of involvement that is possible. And it varies from group to group, from person to person. I think art education creates educational maturity precisely by understanding this and taking it into account. For that, you need professional art mediators, and you need institutions who give them permanent job positions, who give them budget, and who give them opportunities for reflection and research, who give them qualifications, and who give them the possibility of peer consultation, that is, of really working together with other art mediators. So this is my view, my little input to some points that I needed to say and to tell you. And I guess the question the question is still open. I had some answers, and I may have sketched out different fields in which art mediation can do something, and different conditions that it needs. Maybe we can ask, we can answer together later what it can do then. And the conditions are there. So what can we work on? What can we do? So thank you a lot.
Thank you, Bernadette. I think that now you need to stop sharing screen.
Yes.
And yeah, and Darya, please welcome to join in.
Спасибо большое за приглашение. Спасибо большое,
Thank you for
Bernadette.
inviting me to talk here. I'd like to thank Bernadette as well for her first speech today. And it will be easier for me because I now will be able to build upon something that Bernadette has mentioned. Now I will share my screen. I hope everything works. That's my first slide, and we will be going.
Вот теперь, наверное, вы видите ее в полный экран.
Now the full screen is working. So I'm also asking this question, what does art mediation do? Although I think that a better beginning would be to slightly restate it, but first I have to describe my perspective that allowed me to restate this question. Alina has introduced me, but I want to explain in what fields I'm active and why I'm asking this question like I do. While Bernadette focuses her research and practices around art mediation and cultural mediation, art education within a museum space. For me, art mediation is not the focus of my studies. My background is in architecture history, and I'm working a lot with various projects of paper architecture, for example, socialist cities of the future. But my view of this area and what interests me is how architects wanted to create a spatial framework for new social relationships or create conditions, as Bernadett said, conditions and spatial constructs and infrastructures that allow to consider these new social relationships. On the other hand, I'm working at the Beaux-Arts Fine Arts Center, and my job title is Institutional Development Counselor, officially. And I take this job title seriously because I am effecting a kind of a guerrilla change, trying to change this bureaucratic institution from within. And of course, I face resistance. It doesn't mean that I'm such a great counselor that says something and it's done. No, just like Bernadett said, resistance to art mediation and the status of cultural mediation institutions is still not positive enough. But I wanted to refer to this part of my work. And unless my boss is listening to me, I can say that this is an attempt to understand how an institution may be hacked from within or reprogrammed from within. And as Alena mentioned, last year, together with 20 curators from various parts of Russia, we were thinking for a year on this paradoxical subject of care and critique in the work of a curator. And we were trying to consider an institution or an anti-institution of the future, or something between these two poles of institution and anti-institution. And we were working on this through the political theory of care, by rethinking the work and status of a curator, who is on one hand caring for something, and on the other hand critiques something. And this paradoxical space between care and criticism is the way for us to consider the future institution. And this is this context that brings me to the question, what does art mediation do? And I think I will be restating it in a more narrow scope and try to answer it in this narrow scope. Rather, what does art mediation do to cultural institutions? What does it do to the nature of institutions? And of course, institutions are not abstract machines, they're made of people. And so the question is, what do these cultural institutions do to us, cultural workers? People have various attitudes and connections to institutions. And this agency is common for us all. And the next sub-question is, what do cultural institutions and people working in it make of this clash with cultural mediation or art mediation? And in order to keep this grounded and building upon what Bernadett said about the boom of mediation, it's true for Russia as well. The field is growing, and this long list of our jobs often includes mediator and curator and educator, and so on. So our roles multiply. And this boom is not an abstract thing, and I would like to ground it in how these changes are observable. And I think that a litmus test for changes in cultural institutions and their field is the discussion around the definition of a museum proposed by ICOM. It was initially proposed even before 2019, but it was in 2019 when this definition was finally made public. It was not ratified, after all, but I would like to look at it because it radically rethinks the museum space, and I think it captures the role that art mediation played in rethinking our workspace in a museum through meetings with the public and with art in general. And I'll give you the definition first in English, as you can see it on the screen, and then give a short comment with additional information provided by the ICOM Russia.
Inclusive and polyphonic spaces, демократизирующиеся, инклюзивные, по-русски мы все еще переводим как инклюзивные, полифонические пространства.
Democratic and inclusive are words relevant for our Russian practice, and past and futures play the same role here.
Признавая, что вокруг тех артефактов и видов,
Acknowledging that artifacts and specimens can be surrounded by conflicts and challenges, and this is very important. I consider the word conflict very important here. Conflict is part of the definition of a museum.
Safeguard diverse memories for future generations and guarantee equal rights and equal access to heritage for all people. Музеи сохраняют память.
Museums preserve memory and they guarantee equal rights, that I think is very important, together with the phrase for all people. And now the second part of this definition about the status of the museum body.
Музеи не должны приносить.
Museums should not be run for profits, as is listed here. And here the word participatory is introduced, just like Bernadett mentioned in her presentation.
То есть то все, что являлось
a list of tasks and objectives that used to be listed in the previous museum definition. These are the responsibilities of a museum: collecting, preserving, researching, interpreting, exhibiting, and enhancing understanding. This is now done not by the museum itself alone, but in a partnership with and for communities. That's what I want to stress. And this collective work on collecting, preserving, researching, interpreting, exhibiting objects and artifacts is what allows us to enhance understandings of the world. And the final part of the museum mission in this definition is to contribute to human dignity, social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. So museums are setting a political horizon for themselves. And I think that in part this does answer the question what art can do or what art mediation can do. or what art or mediation wish to do. This definition provoked hot debates. Some of them started even before this particular definition was suggested. And I think that it's very interesting to look at how museum professionals from Russia took part in this discussion. They ran a survey of their own in 2018 and suggested a definition of their own. And in their recommendations for a new definition in 2018, it was just the stage of recommendations, not a final definition, but the Russian professionals suggested several things, and here I'm quoting their recommendations. There are two important things. Number one is to consider a possible definition of a museum as a social institution. I think that it is a very salient word for the Russian context, and it is a really meaningful turn of phrase. And number two, consider in the new definition the functions and objectives of a museum in contemporary situation. The respondents of the survey especially emphasize the following processes. These are professionals, topicalization of legacies, interpretation of heritage, and all the next points are about mediation, in my view. Social inclusion, social cohesion, forming a participatory culture, broadcasting values of communities or individuals, promoting cultural self-expression. Here I'm doubting, but in a way, it's also part of definition of mediation. And finally, creating conditions and situations for civic dialogue. And one of the definitions proposed by ICOM in its short formulation is museum is a social institution that topicalizes and interprets material and immaterial heritage of the humanity and its environment through collecting, preserving, documenting, researching, and exhibiting. It's the traditional part of the definition. The museum shares values that are broadcast by various communities, groups, and individuals in accordance to global tendencies in the world and in nature. And of course, I'm interested in the fact that in this discussion, ICOM Russia suggests a very good formulation that cannot be found in the English ICOM definition, which has not yet been ratified, so it might be subject to change, and maybe we will see museums defined as social institutions. But for me, art mediation, what it can do is part of this global rethink of the museum, its space, the space of cultural institutions that are often considered by professionals to be social institutions.
Фактически мы наблюдаем такую интересную, во всяком случае, то, как мы изнутри.
So what we see now, at least from the inside, how we define our work, our labor, we insist on the following discourse. We turn cultural institutions them into social institutions. And here I would focus on the term cultural institutions being transformed into a social institution or a societal institution even, because the word institution has this active connotation. It actively defines what culture is. It's the process of instituting institutions. So we as cultural professionals take part in redefining cultural institutions, and we understand that what we do cannot be limited to the narrow definition of culture. What we do is happening rather in the social realm, in the society, on the scale of society. I believe that we all have to take a minute to think about that. Do we really institute a new society? And can cultural mediation really promote a new society? And this is a double transformation. By rethinking a cultural institution as a social institution, of course, we also rethink our role in it. We stop being a cultural professional or a culture professional. This formula exists in the Russian language, a social worker, social professional, but in Russian it is understood narrowly, the professional who provides medical services to the social groups that need care. It's a very paternalist term right now. I think it is also a representation of the paternalist state that stands for the interests of the weak members of society. But when in culture, we redefine ourselves as social workers, we do not want to reproduce this paternalist scheme, this paternalist pattern. And maybe we need to think about that too. These are the Russian ICOM recommendations. Do we become responsible for social inclusion, for fostering social connections? These are all questions for me. It's not really a statement. And I think all of this adds up to my thinking about the question, what does art mediation do to cultural institutions? I think it transforms our attitude to art objects and our attitude to institutions. We cease thinking about a museum as a space that hosts artifacts, as a kind of a storehouse. When a museum stops being a storehouse, it becomes the space for reinforcing new social connections. And I believe that it is only then that we rethink our role in the institutions. And another question is, how do institutions react to this transformation? In Common Mörsch's edited book, this process is described as a complex navigation. The institution responds to the changing situation, and these responses are complex. It's not a kind of a solid movement. What was important for me, I believe, was to highlight these 2 points of tension. This is the discourse that the institutions produce in themselves or in a dialogue with their surroundings. This is what Coleman spoke about in the first lecture. It is mentioned in the book too, and Bernadett also drew attention to this, that in cultural institutions, new practices that we consider create new hierarchies. And these new hierarchies create new conflicts in institutions. The question is, okay, now we have an army of mediators who sometimes are not even employed by cultural institutions. They work precariously, project-based. They intervene and somehow try to transform the institution all of a sudden for the institution. I think what happens here are 2 very important processes. On the one hand, these institutions experience pressure from below and from above, below from the mediators, from above from their sponsors. Bozar, for example, faces this problem quite regularly. And the hope here is that institutions will provide some social effects, what is called in English social cohesion, provide for some social communication. And what happens here too is instrumentalization of education departments. Education departments are used to draw finance, provide inclusive participatory practice in the institution, but in the perfect scenario, these educational departments cannot intervene radically into the hierarchies. The most evident problem is that although art mediation is widespread and we talk about it a lot, education departments do not grow in number. Very few new positions are opened, and the role of directors of education departments in the institutions does not become more important, far from that. So education departments are not as important as financial directors. What happens in these cultural institutions? And what does cultural mediation do to cultural workers? Partially, and here I ask a question, does it mean that we need to self-organize, to form trade unions, to respond to this pressure, the pressure of instrumentalizing education departments, creating professional positions, setting up a golden standard of art mediation, insisting on the quality standard, insisting on what art mediation is truly, striving to transform the institution from inside. These are all big questions, but I don't want to ponder today on this question of inter-institutional fight. Of course, I would support mediators, and I would say that solidarization is very important. But I believe that if we focus only on our fight in the institutions, we cultural workers that operate in this context, we avoid a certain number of very important questions. And I think these questions become more evident when we think that art mediation has a disruptive effect, not just in the institution, but in the space around this institution. For a long time, I was thinking about what should I call this space beyond institutions. I chose this formula around institutions. I think art mediation blurs the boundary between the institutions and the society. And by blurring these boundaries, by stepping on the territory beyond the clearly defined walls of cultural consumption, we find ourselves in a kind of a new space. And in this space, we can ask new questions, I believe. Some of them can be directed at ourselves. Who are we as cultural mediators? And now I'm looking at the clock, and I know that my time is limited. I will try not to go in depth now. But when I think about this, John Tronto's book helps me. We read this book with our colleagues, curators from different Russian regions. A feminist political scientist, John Tronto. She tries to think of the democracy of care, or to rethink the society through the perspective of care. She suggests a very interesting contradiction. She tries to remind us that when we try to think of a democratic society, one of the tools that may help us do that is the idea of responsibility. And in particular, we can think of democracy as the distribution of areas of social and individual responsibility. Here is a simple example. Over the past 30 years, in the context of neoliberal transformation, a huge number of questions was squeezed into the space of personal accountability. We now are responsible for our mental health, for our regimen. We need to exercise, we need to eat healthy food. It's all on our shoulders now. While the healthcare service is subject to saving, to financial reforms. So everything that used to be the social responsibility now is our individual responsibility. And the big question is, how do we as society distribute the accountability, the responsibility? What becomes the responsibility of the community? What becomes our individual responsibility? And from the perspective of cultural institutions who are now immersed into this context of social transformation, who try to turn into social institutions, at least they say that, they claim that they want to do so, that declare that they want to support social connections, create the participatory culture. And this leads us to the next question. When cultural institutions take this responsibility, who do we take this responsibility from? Or in other words, who we take this responsibility from? The state educational institutions. And Joan Tronto, for example, suggests, when she describes this dilemma of a more caring democracy, she says that it's very important sometimes to understand the privilege of the lack of responsibility, and this formula of the lack of responsibility may help us to understand what we do when we take this responsibility as cultural institutions, as cultural professionals, and who do we give this indulgence or the privilege of the lack of responsibility when we do so? Because I think that it's true that we are all full of the best intentions. But when we take this responsibility, and when we think, and of course the intentions are beautiful, are humane, but it seems like we avoid these very important negotiations, this collective decision-making process of how we in the society distribute responsibility for all of these aspects of life.
Отойти, не потому что я не думаю, что
I turn to this subject because I don't think that cultural institutions should eschew this responsibility, should flee it. I think we should take this new responsibility seriously and protect it from being profanized and abused. But I think that if we take this responsibility seriously, then it's important to ask ourselves, whose zone of responsibility is this? And to whom did this responsibility belong before that? This might also entail some struggle or coalitioning on the other hand. Maybe the institution that takes on this responsibility shouldn't remain alone. We're always seeing budgetary cuts, and now we are taking on this responsibility from the government. from our private partners, from educational institutions, and so on. And being serious about how sensitive this might become for the whole society, this discussion on responsibilities within society. This question makes us, mediators and cultural workers, to think about our own identity. It requires some kind of political identity building and self-determination. And here, the next fundamental question comes. We're talking about very positive intentions, and we're always striving for something positive and helpful when we are mediating. But what is it? What are the utopian horizons of cultural mediation? What kind of society do we want to build? What do we want to broadcast to our visitors or to our partners who ideally are not passive? What kind of a community do they want to build? And I think here it's time to stop for a while and ask the question, why at all do we aspire to democratizing knowledge production and transmission practices? We have already taken some educational practices from institutions of general education. We are already interacting with schools or universities, or we see the potential of mediation and art education in spaces of art that can help this education institution to transform itself. But anyway, why do we aspire to democratization, and what political role do we play in this? So why do we strive for maximum democratization of knowledge production and transmission? And this question might be phrased differently, because when we look at mediation practices in museum spaces, they're not just learning experiences, they're not educational experiences or even unlearning experiences. They're also practices of free communication and care. And here, my studies of Soviet architecture helped me, because there, architects were thinking about a society of equals and a new infrastructure of equality for a society where communication is as free as possible and information exchange is as free as possible. And in this society, care is not limited to particular social structures like family or a mental asylum, however dated this might be. And so the question that I'm proposing is, what political role could these new practices of free communication and care play? And isn't this too much to fit into the artistic space, the space of art? And maybe what we can do in the territory of art to take part in this broader process of societal transformation? I think this big question is a fitting point for me to stop. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dasha. I've got 5 pages of questions, but I think I will delay them for later. It really provoked me to a lot of thoughts. Thank you, Bernadett. Thank you, Darya. I would really love to have an unending dialogue with you, but we are still limited on time. So that's why I would start with your comments. Question to both our speakers. Have you got any comments to the other speakers' presentation? To each other's presentations. Darya? So, Bernadett, I think that in the end of your introduction, you touched upon an important subject, that art mediation is a way to try or to experiment with gaining political agency, with obtaining this feeling of being an actor, a politically active subject in a limited context, within the space of a museum, in the context of special time, specific time and space. It's a safe space. But anyway, it is a space to try to become not just a visitor, but a participator. And from this, from participant, thinking oneself as a politically active subject. And so my question is rather broad in this regard, about the role of art mediation in the unpolitization or politicization of our visitors, making them more or less political. Because I think at this stage, culture and art, both in the West and in Russia, are working in both directions at the same point. And do you see any contradiction in this, or maybe not? And where to go next? What do you think? In where and what should not be expected from us? Where we should stop like this?
Yeah, thank you for the questions, Darya. Yeah, I guess it's very interesting to think about politicizing others. If we think about political agency, I would ask, what does political agency contain? For me, it would contain a lot of individual parts. So it's still agency for a subject, for individual subject, or for collective subjects. And the part of the individual subject is a major theme for me. I have been thinking a lot about being exposed, so about theories of precarity, of exposition, and this is namely queer feminist theories, stemming partly from what Judith Butler does, stemming a lot from feminist affect studies, like Sarah Ahmed, like a scholar, Sarah Ahmed. So I may comment on this by saying, how do we gain emotional agency, or how do we develop our understanding of how far emotional agency is linked to gaining individual agency, political agency, maybe collective agency. So it may be necessary that we write an article together on both, on this linkage. For now, I have not one answer, but I just can link these two fields together, which I think are important very much. Like I mentioned before, that in transformational art education, for me, it's a crucial point in working on relationality, on human relationality. And I guess you are working on the concept of care is very much linked to this. Can I politicize? Sorry?
That's great. It really answers partially to my question in showing this one more link that sometimes we miss. So that not to think immediately big terms like political agency, right? We can make several steps, and I think the concept of emotional agency and individual agency are super important, so that we don't jump too quickly to to this oversimplified generalizations.
Yeah, I've learned that for me, this emancipation is in small steps. I would really agree to you in that way. For example, when I, like in my past, in my biography, started to go to the streets to attend a manifestation, it was not so much, it was about appearing in public at all, and what it does to me about all this, like appearing in public at all. For example, we had a manifestation, just being there on a public space, just being there, having a couch there, a table, a lamp, and some books. And this was groundbreaking. And it was not a radical manifestation, or like in a way, this politics, for me, politics of feeling or of affect are a way to get further slowly. Yeah, but now, like what I wanted to comment on basically was the concept of care, but now we are already quite in it. I would love to hear more about the combination of criticism and care that you mentioned. And we may speak about an example or a specific problem to make it maybe on a concrete base, put it on a concrete basis. Can you think of something?
Alina, in order maybe not to deviate, я чувствую, что чтобы мы не погрязли.
So, for us not to deviate into a very long discussion about care and criticism, maybe Alina could help us with turning this so that it aligns closer to our initial subject. Yes, in fact, I would like to ground us a bit more and discuss specific examples and practices of each other. Maybe in your case, you could give us an example or consider a possible example of such a caring mediation, if it's not intrinsically caring always, if care is not a structural necessity for any mediation to take place, and whether this caring mediation can be critical. Isn't it a paradox? Isn't it a contradiction that would destroy mediation or care from within? And to develop a further question to Bernadett, I would really love to hear when you were talking about the provocation and disappointment as possible strategies of mediation. Could you give us examples of mediations in which provocation and disappointment could be working strategies?
И у нас уже вопросы от аудитории приходят, поэтому я надеюсь, что мы живо войдем в дискуссию.
Go, Bernadett.
Shall I perform it or shall I say it? If I performed it, I would answer in a way that you can't, that you would dislike. For example, as an art mediator, I have a role assigned to myself of knowing about art, for example, of being professional, of being a highbrow person, of talking with a distinguished accent, all these things. I have worked on this role, and this is precarious, but it works very well. If you, what's the word? Visitors, for example, everybody who comes has an expectation, and I can deceive these expectations very easily by breaking the rules of distinction, by breaking the rule of habitus. But at the same time, when I do this, I'm aware that I make myself vulnerable at all, because somebody who talks the wrong accent seems to be a person who can't talk or can't say much about contemporary art. And we have a very exclusive field here, so you can. I rather suggest working with slight differences in this, and then changing the level So going to a meta level as well. So when I use the strategy, I work with a slight difference normally, and then I go to a meta level to make way to reflecting on this. So I change the position in a way 2 times. So that's a way about reflecting on authority in the field of contemporary art, for example. It is dangerous. It's not the best way, maybe.
Я прям буквально только очень короткую реплику тогда вброшу, чтобы не
I will
застревать.
say a very short remark, not to stay here for too long and to leave space for everybody who wants to ask their questions. Of course, I can't conceive of the right caring mediation, but what the theory of care teaches us, or the questions that it teaches us to pose, lead us to the following.
Функция человека, который берет, тот человек, который берет на себя роль заботящегося, заключается в том числе в том, чтобы не определять
The person who takes up the role of a carer
а именно в том числе
learns
очень приложимым к культурным институциям
to think of the needs of the caree.
Посетителей и наших партнеров, каковы их потребности, когда они приходят на нашу арт-медиацию.
And it's important for us not to think for the visitors, what their needs are. We need to work with the needs that are there. We need to be able to draw the map of needs and work with them.
Создали ли мы такие условия, в которых мы можем действительно
Have we really created the right conditions where we can take into account the needs of all participants? Or maybe somebody is excluded already because of the language we use or because of the position that we take.
Это просто эти фундаментальные какие-то вещи, которые уже исключили в эту нашу...
These are the fundamental, the basic things that can exclude a lot of people from the audience. And I'm not talking here about building the society of the future. I mean very specific things, taking care of these very specific needs.
И в этом смысле, мне кажется, такой разговор может происходить именно на территории.
So I think this kind of a conversation can happen on the territory of art mediation because the very disposition around art mediation enables such a dialogue, such a conversation that works both ways and that is not rigid.
Внутри институции, да, о потребностях, например, разных отделов.
We need to foster this dialogue in the institution between different departments.
Спасибо. Я хочу прочитать вопрос, потому что, мне кажется, он очень важный для дискуссии, от Анастасии. Скажите, пожалуйста, какой вы...
I want to read out one more question from Anastasia. I think it's very important for our conversation. How do you see the role of the visitor in mediation and in the transformation of the museum practice in general? Not just getting, pleasure, enjoying and spending time. What is the role of the audience? Bernadett, would you like to take this question?
О роли зрителя. Это важный момент.
What is the role of the audience? How you see it?
The audience is made up out of individuals. There is no audience, I would say. But I can give them a role. That's that much as I can say.
И эта роль может быть роль агента.
This role that you give, can it be the role of the agent of transformations? Do you understand?
I mean, it's almost philosophical. Or if I give somebody the role of being the agent of a transformation,
Да.
that doesn't work. I need to make myself unnecessary in the process. That's the old pedagogic paradox of emancipation. So you're right there. I can't give anybody a role because then it's not the thing, but I have to try to start there. And of course, it's never the whole of the public. It may be small steps, and it may be exemplary. Sorry, my English. Like exemplary practices, examples, slight changes, irritations. The same thing that I said before. Because if the institution itself doesn't re-democratize radically, I mean, we have no Russian Revolution there, I guess, and not in the way that it used to be understood. So the new museum or the new public, the new society, is not invented or is not performed yet there.
Я правильно понимаю, что для того, чтобы трансформация действительно имела место...
Do I get it right that for the transformation to take place, indeed, institution has to create conditions first for the transformation to be possible? So this kind of participation of the audience will be the real participation only then. For now, it's just, enjoying oneself, spending free time. It's a kind of an entertainment. But participation will be real participation only if the audience provides tools for participation, for engagement. So the institution has to want to transform, and only then mediator will be able to facilitate this process. Visitors will turn into participants, and together they will be able to transform. The desire to transform has to come from above. It's not grassroots initiative, or can it be grassroots? I think it's an important paradox indeed. I mean, sometimes it's true that we don't want to reproduce the paternalist model. The paternalist model comes with the theatrical metaphors, the role, the piece, the play, like it's not serious, like we're just playing the part. Please come here, we will play we'll play the game of transformation. And I think this is a problematic bit of our practice. And I think that it keeps keeping the audience comfortable. I mean, it's a very comfortable position to come to an exhibition about the climate change, even discuss how we can change our everyday habits with the mediator and then do nothing. Keep using plastic. Very often when we come together home after the exhibition, we very often forget what was discussed there. We heal our political agency, and we as mediators and institution reproduce apoliticization, and this is a big part of the contemporary cultural consumption, how it is organized and what role it plays in the political subjectivation. On the other hand, when we do not use this metaphors of theater, if we really try to create the conditions for participation, then we lose this important role. We cease being these important cultural institutions that know everything and that from the age of enlightenment keep educating the public. Museums were established by nation states to educate the new citizen. And if we reject that role, we also lose the role of an all-knowing institution. We can't keep playing this perfect place anymore. When we lose this role, when we reject this role, then we need to find a different kind of approach. I mean, our mission can be perfect, saving the planet, but if we keep the paternalist approach, then we become the participants of the former model. I don't have a lot of alternative metaphors, unfortunately, but Sometimes I use the metaphor of compost because actually this is unclear in what proportion these different elements produce the new reality, new soil, new ground. We know that some proportions are needed, some percentage is needed of the organic materials. And we know that it's not just about bringing a lot of elements together. Composting is much more difficult. But in this process, it's true that there are no actors, no directors, or rather this process doesn't have a director. The worms are there in the compost, but they are non-human agents. So we need to start thinking in the metaphors that help us think the process collectively. We can, of course, take an important role still, but maybe we don't need this role of an all-knowing agent anymore. The cultural leadership discourse, I think, is quite problematic, pretty much like all other neoliberal discourses. Because I mean, the leaders are guiding, like they're still all-knowing, they know where to go. I'm not sure whether we can enter all of these difficult processes from this position. There is another question now in the chat, or rather a comment which is quite pessimistic. I thought the audience was just the means for the institution. I think it's an interesting comment because it raises a good question. I mean, the audience or specific subjects, specific individuals that come to the institution, do they really have the agency to transform the institution, to be part of the collective, to democratically participate in what is happening? Dasha, I think you spoke about that. My spontaneous response would be that in the popular discourse, there are formulas already. We see all of these options for the audience already. First, the footfall. The audience can vote with their attendance, coming or not coming. They can vote with their money, paying for events. So it's not only about them being a financial and economic actor. It's also about the engaging institution, and it gives us feedback on how we effectively construct our institutions. Very often we deprive the audience from all other roles. We see the audience just as an economic agent that can bring us money and a biological unit that is present with their body in the space or is absent from the space. But the fact that this body may also have a political agency, some desires or some will to build a community together with this institution seems preposterous.
Между нашим музеем и домом создать какое-то пространство. Ну, то есть
the local community can do lots of things in the space, for example, between their houses in the courtyard, and that means a completely different kind of political agency. And of course, what mediation does more and more is precisely creating these multiple identities, seeing these different kinds of audiences, suggesting different strategies of interacting with the institution.
С одной стороны, признаем их как множество, что уже круто, мы уже признаем разнообразие.
This way we recognize their diversity and their multiplicity as an institution, but we don't give them a foundation for unification. We don't give them a common ground, and this is an issue of contemporary institutions, because we're creating so many programs. For example, in Brussels is one of the most cosmopolitan European cities. And if we are creating more and more programs for various ethnicities and diasporas, on the one hand, it's positive because it's various languages and cultures finding their spaces. But on the other hand, we are destroying kind of a common cultural base for the whole civilization, for any kind of community beyond these singular identities. So this is a contradiction. Bernadett, have you got any comment?
I was just thinking, yeah, short one maybe, that we just have to keep up and support the ambivalence. We have to live with it. And maybe that's a job of the art mediators. Maybe it's a job of the public to gain visibility. And that's ambivalent as well, because gaining, yeah, you can't do it all alone on your own. You have to be granted visibility and you have to gain it. Maybe it's both. And so the public may gain visibility for us, but our job is to support the ambivalence of not trying not to be paternalistic and still trying to transform and trying to make things different. Same thing that you just talked about, Darya, with the diversity and the common ground. Sure, we're just there. If not, something happens that I just was thinking about this example. I work at I'm German, but I work at a big Swiss higher art institution, higher art school, Art Academy of Zurich. And the boss of the whole thing, when he started his job, he came with the idea of the whole school being the orchestra and him being the orchestra leader. And he said that's a democratic idea because everybody does their thing. They do what they can do best. So the flutists play the flute, the drums play the drum, and so on. Everybody can come together and contribute to the whole. And I was just thinking that who chooses in the music and who writes the music? This metaphor is just not working. Yeah, so that was just an example. So we got to keep up the ambivalence and living with it, I guess.
We've got two comments from our listeners. One of them is half comment and half question. First, a comment from Oksana. I liked that I heard about care. I was never considering our interaction with participants as care. I was more thinking about this in terms of respect. And now a question from Anastasia. Can such a situation arise when mediation slips from the institutional control because the institution does not control the feedback? Can it happen, Darya, that mediation is not under control? Or maybe, if I can rephrase the question from our listener, question of control by itself. To what extent can mediation be controlled? Is mediation as practice controllable at all? And if we move a bit further from this, what do we expect from mediation? It could have been a question that we could have started with, but it's still relevant. We're asking, why do we need transformation? Why do we believe that transformation is positive? Why do we democratize our institutions? And so on and so forth. Many serious questions. But the first question is, what do we expect from mediation? Mediation is a tool that leads to this transformation, or does it? And to what extent can we control it? To what extent do we want to control it so that it brings us to these goals? Or there is a line of thinking that says that mediation creates an unscripted, uncontrolled space that can host anything. And this is the strength of mediation. What do you think, dear speakers? What's the objective of mediation? What's its agency about? Does it create a controlled space or an uncontrolled space?
That's a hard one. Yeah. That's a hard question. I would say I consider, my perspective is always that I consider something opposite to control first.
Mm-hmm.
That of course I work towards having a certain amount of control when I'm in a situation. So that talking on the level of the situation, of the dialogue, of the interaction, it's both, of course. But maybe Darya can say something on the level of the institution or the general level.
Действительно сложный вопрос, потому что вопрос...
Yes, it's a hard question because it's not clear where to start answering it. I think for a mediator, and I think my colleagues here could correct me, but I believe that mediators themselves think about this process as an open-ended process. It's not a hard script. It has some script, but it has many branches and bifurcations that allow you to escape a prescribed final. For an institution, mediation that historically grew out of this pressure to get new public, it is a part of audience development historically. It's about increasing number of visitors. It's about changing class and gender structure, racial structure of the audience, because we realize that we cannot stay an institution for the elite. So historically, for an institution, mediation was the perfect finale because it allowed the institution to create new relationships with their public. And then we realize that this is a process that does not have an endpoint because society keeps changing and class criteria that used to exist are not relevant anymore. We wanted to make bourgeois institutions more accessible for non-bourgeois art consumers once, but since then, the society structure has changed so much that it cannot be described through bourgeois versus proletariat anymore. So the institution has to continuously follow the changes in the society, and its only helper for this process is mediation. On the other hand, mediation, how it works today within institutions, is it the only resource that an institution has? Is mediation its only resource? And here, we're coming back to the question whether mediation itself has to change or develop in order to implement their connection to the society. Maybe it has to take different forms in order to keep up this connection. And of course, not all practices that we now consider as art education practices in a museum space can solve these problems and can reach these institutional objectives. And we realize that the society, while changing, it is looking for someone to help it change. And can institutions become helpers and agents of this change for this collective mutation of the society? It's a question that institutions can ask of themselves, and I agree with Bernadett that there is some work for the public to do, to knock on the doors of the institution, to demand representation and visibility. We had this slogan in the opposition in 2012, "You do not represent us." This is an accurate description, but maybe we see failures of representative democracy, and maybe we should go outside of the whole idea of representation. But until the society comes to us and knocks on our door, we shouldn't be expecting the institution to decide how mediation would look. because if we allow it to decide, then we are still in the paternalistic situation, and the mutation is not happening. But I'd like to remind us all that institution is people and people are us. So the borders between institution, cultural worker, and visitor and public, they are much less defined than it could be seen. Anastasia has joined us with a video link. It was her question initially. Would she like to add something? Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentations. I had some experience as mediator. That's why I'm interested in this process. I'm interested in looking at it from within. And still, I mainly position myself as a member of the audience, as a viewer or visitor. I'm not linked to the institution in my ordinary life. This institution made me a mediator once, but generally I'm not. So the mediator can also be detached from the institution and can accept various meanings from peoples with whom they're interacting. And during discussion, people are broadcasting and transmitting lots of meanings to the mediator. They may be talking about their own life in a prolonged dialogue. And this unfolding of stories becomes something that exists side by side with the exhibition with its own life, its interpretation by the curator, its interpretation by the public, and this is all put onto the mediator's shoulders, and the mediator has to bear it. And whence should the mediator go? Where should they bear it all? I heard from you that institutions don't really need lots of feedback. They don't want to control the process. So my question is the following. Cannot mediation become something out of control because mediators could not be able to cope with the situation, with this transmission of lots of meanings? A dialogue that spills out of the institution becomes something else.
Которые будут вообще станут какой-то очень важной силой в трансформации
A
общества.
free association of mediators that will transform the society. I think this should be the result of this workshop. We should found such an association. Anastasia, thank you very much for your comment. That was valuable. Darya, Bernadett, if you have any response, you're welcome. If you don't, I saw that Darya has a question too. Yeah, thank you. I rather wanted to make a comment, not a question. I wanted to respond to what has just been said. I think the question raised by Anastasia is extremely important, and it can be analyzed on very different levels, I think. Sorry, Darya, the sound is off. It seems like the connection is bad. The problem of the responsibility of the mediator, the feedback that we get or we don't get, and should we get feedback, how we should analyze it. Very often questions are asked about how to evaluate participatory projects. I hear these discussions very often these days. And I don't have a universal answer to how participation should be analyzed and what it gives both institutions and communities. I think it's also part of our desire to control everything, to control the work of mediators. Because this is a kind of an unusual way of engaging the public. It's an unusual way of redistributing the responsibility. So there are a lot of things to discuss here, I think. That's true, and Anya in the chat already comments on this. She says, this is exactly what happens. Mediators do not work with the institutions. Institutions do not want each other work. It's like the mediators are the responsible here. And here the question that arises is, what do mediators want?
Это какая-то осмысленная коммуникация медиаторами становится, потому что там есть несколько
I think that for them, this communication is meaningful. People become mediators because of some fundamental beliefs that are necessary for this kind of activity. Maybe we need to go into these beliefs. Maybe we need to discuss what it means in these practices, in the institutional context and in the political context too. In the Russian reality, we
Слава богу, они не признаны таковыми, потому что сейчас все образовательные практики, которые не
work as mediators. Fortunately, it's not certified as educational activity because all educational activities that are legally not approved of by the state become problematic. Our current legislation starts to regulate very harshly the sphere of education. Fortunately, we're still in this area of autonomy, and I believe that this autonomy is very important for us. This is why I asked this question about art. So maybe something happens on the territory of art differently. And Anastasia was trying to explain it with this polyphony of meanings between the physical space of the exhibition, the ideas of artists, the ideas of the curator, the reactions and interpretations, and the meanings that are born when you come to watch the exhibition. Maybe it's true that on the territory of art, there are separate meanings or separate conditions. And maybe it would be best for us to see these fundamental beliefs for what they are, and maybe we'll need to, split into a couple of parties. There will be a party of mediators who will want to be controlled by institutions, and a party of mediators who want to stay free. But maybe in this process, we will be able at least to see these fundamental beliefs for what they are, and from there build communication in our professional community. Bernadett, would you like to say something?
No, for the moment, thanks.
Анна продолжает и говорит...
And keeps writing in the chat. That's natural because a true mediator is a contemporary artist and unfortunately an activist and a free educator. Many of us are nodding their head. I can see we feel solidarity with Anna is saying. No, thank you very much for what you say, because at some point when I was thinking about what question to talk about, I wanted to ask this question, like when we ignore these fundamental beliefs and when we just want to fight for all good against everything evil, do we become activists? It seems like we lose the role of mediator, because a mediator is not an activist. We mediate. We do not promote something. But this figure of an activist who works for free, an activist who compensates the lack of knowledge which our visitors could not get from the institutions anywhere else. This is also a very sharp political question. I think it's a very important question for our profession. And it's true that the situation here will be very different from, say, the role of mediators in traditional museums, and working, for example, in Europe will be different from working in Russia. Pretty much like working in a small center will be very different from working in a huge museum. And I think we have to, of course, support all of these local stories. but at the same time, the question of beliefs is very important. So the question is, do we want to be activists? And if so, what do we want to fight for? We have just 5 minutes left, so we have the last but one chance to ask a question to Darya or to Bernadett or to both of them. If there are no questions for now, I want to share my new awareness. I entered this conversation, and in general, the conversation about mediation. I didn't like the term mediator. I thought that mediation is educational practice, of course, no doubt. And when we lose the word pedagogics or education, we lose this political dimension, which is very important. Now, over the course of these 2 hours, a transformation happened to me. The transformation we talked about happened to me. I found that mediation is a very precise word for what we've been talking about today. And we work on the intersection of powers, of positions, of emotions, and mediator is somebody who mediates, who is in between. We talked about mediation in institutions. We talked about different institutional roles, about different positions in institutions. We talk about mediation as a practice of mediation between an art piece and the audience, between the institution and the audience, between the institution and outer communities. This is a very potentially conflict-charged, multi-vector position, the position that disrupts itself from within. So in my imagination, mediation now is conceived as uncontrollable subject, a disruptive subject. And however weird it may sound, now I find myself thinking that mediation is the best word for this unbalanced state of affairs, this unbalanced position. It's not like I'm drawing the bottom line. It may sound like a bottom line. I'm just sharing my new feeling. And Oksana says that mediation is a philosophical practice in the chat.
Can I add one thing, Alina? That's excellent. I was just thinking that, like, when the educational turn started in Germany, where I come from, around 2006, we all considered ourselves as activists. So art education, art mediation was being an activist. So we thought of ourselves as the avant-garde. Then a year later, I got to Berlin, and this was the first as activists among ourselves. When I got to Berlin for the Berlin Biennial 5 with Adam Zimschick and Elena Filipovic, the artists thought, when we tried to translate it to English, the artists thought art mediation is some kind of yoga. It's like, you're the meditation team. Oh, now we said, we're the art mediators, can we ask you some questions? And they were like, yeah, what, you're doing yoga? This was so crazy. So now I thought about what you're saying, Alina, is mediating just maybe, yeah, keeping up inside all these relations and keeping up with the ambivalence of acting at all. Because sometimes art itself is critical already. If I explain it, like Oliver Marchart pointed out, I do nothing much. I'm affirmative. But if I say what the art says, and the art says something that I would say as well, and I just explain it, and I'm affirmative, but still I'm affirmative to something critical, possibly. So do I always have to have the same position? No, I don't. I will change my position, of course. But you put it much better than me. Thank you. But let's just think we are a yoga team as well. I like the idea.
I also adore this yoga connection and this mediation as this meditation practice, because in some way, if we are also to put this care ethics optics, then think of this caring democracy as taking care of the needs and accounting for very particular social relations, then actually the figure of mediator becomes a very important figure in building this caring democracy. Because to account for this plurality and diversity of relations, you actually suddenly need much more care agents, people who take care of these relations and making sense of these relations and making sense of these needs. So maybe maybe mediators are now actually indeed some kind of pioneers of very particular form of political action, and maybe we should keep on trying.
We should keep on trying. I'm switching to English as well, because Bernadett suggested a beautiful, in my opinion, beautiful play of words when she said that mediation is not about public relations, but rather about human relations, which I think is super important to keep in mind. Be that human relations yoga-based or purely care-based.
Or art-based.
Or art-based, indeed. We keep forgetting about art. That's my fault. I think we should call it a day, unfortunately. Unfortunately, time flew fast. And if anybody has a very quick remark or a question, we can take it and then part ways. Если нет, я обратно, да, жонглирую языками, обратно.
Okay, it seems like no more remarks are there. I want to express my gratitude to Darya and to Bernadett. Thank you very much for today's evening, for these 2 hours. And if you have a chance, please join us again. We will have more workshops on the 15th of November with Alexander Ivanov. We will be compiling a guide on art mediation, and I think that what we've discussed today will be really valuable on Monday. You're most welcome, and everybody else, please register. There is a question in the chat about registration. We will answer as soon as the meeting is over. We will contact you, Ekaterina. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Have a good evening.